Welcome back, or if you were not here this morning, welcome to Dutch Drawings on the Horizon, a day of talks in honor of George Abrams. So just a quick note, there's a slight change in the program. We had planned originally a roundtable discussion with George Abrams, but we thought that at the end of this exciting day, you might want to hear more from the man of the hour, George himself. So we've decided to turn the roundtable into a discussion between George and Peter Sutton, who's going to be the chair of this afternoon session. But there will be opportunities for questions. So that's the plan. So it's my pleasure to very briefly introduce Peter Sutton. He is the director of the Bruce Museum in Greenwich and was previously the director of the Wadsworth Atheneum. He was also a long-time curator of painting at the MFA and has curated several monumental exhibitions. So, Peter, please join us, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be introducing this afternoon's speakers. The first one will be actually done in absentia. This is kind of a tricky business. So actually Susan will be channeling Martin Royalton Kish, who alas could not travel to this venue this morning, but Susan will deliver his talk, and he has written it all out. As you know, Martin is a very distinguished curator. He was the senior curator in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the British Museum until 2009. He's published and lectured extensively on Dutch and Flemish art. His books and catalogues include Adriaan van de Wende's album in the British Museum, drawings by Rembrandt and his circle in the British Museum, The Light of Nature, landscape drawings and watercolors by Van Dyck and his contemporaries, and his full catalogue of the drawings of Rembrandt and his school in the British Museum has been online since 2010, and he's currently taking a Herculean chore on. He's updating Otto Beneš's drawings of Rembrandt from 1963. So he is very well versed in Rembrandt drawings, and he's going to critique, among other people's, my catalog of George's Rembrandt and Rembrandt drawings. So we hope he will be gentle, but I'm going to call on Susan now to come up and to deliver Martin's talk.
Peter, thank you. And actually, Martin did a voice recording of his talk, which we are going to do our best to play for you. And those of you who know Martin, his voice is part of the man. So when I heard his voice again after such a long time testing this out, it was real delight and pleasure.
I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but this is an attempt to use technology to give my talk and to be with you at least with my voice. So let's go for it and hope for the best. It'll also be a way of checking whether it'll take more than 20 minutes. There can be few clearer ways for someone to demonstrate their commitment to the field of 17th century Dutch drawings than by buying a wide range of works, including some by the top masters such as Rembrandt. Over the years, not without blood, tears, toil and sweat, and one might add a little subterfuge, George Abrams, until 2002 with his late and much lamented wife Maida, has managed to put together a great collection with a fine and interesting group of drawings by and attributed to Rembrandt, as well as by Ruysdael and all the other luminaries of Dutch drawing of the period. These drawings are emblematic of George and Maida's long-standing interest in the field over many years, supporting exhibitions, encouraging scholars, contributing towards symposiums and publications in a very significant way. We happily acknowledge and express our gratitude for that interest, commitment, and support. An exhibition of drawings by Rembrandt, his students, and circle from the Maida and George Abrams collection was held at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich in 2011-12. This will be the starting point for the comments that follow. The handsome and detailed catalogue of the exhibition was written by Peter Sutton and Bill Robinson, both old friends and close acolytes of George and Maida, and it is a model of its type with excellent entries and good illustrations, and the volume was beautifully produced. 10 drawings were included in the catalogue and in the exhibition as by Rembrandt or attributed to him, and here they all are in small illustrations. There are 11 images because the first drawing on the left of the middle row has a recto and verso. In many ways they represent as a group a microcosm of the kinds of problems facing any would-be cataloguer of Rembrandt's drawings. We will look at them all, but in some cases, mainly the unproblematic cases, only very briefly. As a group, they cover quite a range of dates, subjects, and styles, from the drawing thought to represent Zacharias and the Angel, a sketchy sheet of around 1634-35, to the fine and in one case rather finished landscapes of the 1650s from the Chatsworth collection, both of which bear the mark of Nicholas Flink, the son of Rembrandt's pupil Govert Flink. Some of the drawings, the earlier ones, already feature on my website devoted to updating Otto Beneš's catalogue raisonné of Rembrandt's drawings. Let's start with a tricky drawing, accepted without demur, but also without much critique by Peter Sutton in the catalogue, as I'm sure he would agree. It's a tiny drawing, blown up from just 68 by 64 millimeters to enormous proportions on the screen. Peter thought it might represent an actor, with a figure possibly reading on the verso. But the verso could perhaps equally be a false start for a declaiming figure, like the one on the recto, with the arm protruding to the left edge of the sheet, and the hand cut off. Both sides of the sheet are slight if lively, and had never previously been published at all, although many of us have known the drawing since the 1980s. The main reason for the lack of attention is that we've always felt that the attribution was problematic, to say the least. 2 years after the publication of the Greenwich catalogue, I posted a brief text on the drawing on my website in 2013 as follows. The drawing is close to Rembrandt's sketches for his St. John the Baptist preaching, such as Beneš 140, but the style is less energetic, with an uncharacteristic tendency towards the decorative. The pose might have been inspired by Beneš 142a. And here are the comparisons, which I hope clarify the text. The Berlin drawing of Listeners for the St. John, here in the centre, seems to have a different quality altogether in the way individual forms are described, whether an arm or a head, and the abbreviated hands also generally lack comparable features. The touch in the Berlin drawing is more forceful, economical, and confident, and more varied in touch, giving a greater sense of 3 dimensions. But that is not to say that the Abrams drawing is greatly inferior in quality. Another drawing that might be brought into the discussion is the Daughters of Cecrops opening the chest containing Erichthonius, another small fragment that forms part of a group that Holm Bevers has assigned to Rembrandt's pupil Jan Victors. At all events, it's not been seriously considered as a work by Rembrandt for many years. The gestures are of course more exaggerated here because of the subject depicted, but the treatment of individual forms and even the shading seems reasonably close to the Abrams sheet, with its somewhat fragmented approach to line and form. The small looped line at the bottom right of the figure, on the recto of the Abrams drawing, behind his elbow, is one of many touches that undermine the attribution to Rembrandt because they are uncharacteristic of him. So is the rather wooden, flat drawing of the arm, which resembles the other sketch on the screen. Whether these drawings are both by Jan Victors or another artist, or even by the same artist, remains in my opinion an open question, but they all seem likely to have been made by a pupil or pupils in Rembrandt's studio. And because of the links with Rembrandt's drawings of St. John, it seems likely that they date from around 1634 to 35. On my website, the Abrams drawing is catalogued as Rembrandt ? With 2 question marks, meaning that the drawing is associated with Rembrandt and that an attribution to Rembrandt is unlikely but not impossible. Indeed, as a believer that Rembrandt himself could be enormously varied in style, it is true that I cannot completely discount the possibility that Rembrandt made it. But the stylistic and other evidence makes an attribution to him seem improbable. But as yet, it has not been possible to connect the drawing convincingly with any of Rembrandt's pupils, such as Govert Flinck or Gerbrand van den Eekhout, or even Jan Victors, in my opinion. The 1630s is also the period of this fine drawing of an old man with a walking stick and a sketch of the head of a young woman. In the Greenwich catalogue, it's dated to around 1633 to 34, but online I've placed it later and slightly more vaguely to 1636 to 42. Why? Well, in a number of drawings of the mid-1630s, Rembrandt used a thin nib, as in the Abrams drawing, and with comparable stylistic results, including the drawing at the lower left from the British Museum, which in fact I think is slightly earlier. The attention to detail in the face is similar, although the drapery in the Abrams drawing at the top is somewhat more abstracted. Sometimes we observe such differences, but do not need to conclude that another artist was involved, particularly given the experimental nature of so much of Rembrandt's art. This is a point we will return to later. Yet there are also links with later drawings, such as the 2 Orientals in Discussion, a signed and dated work of 1641, and the Iron Gall ink drawings made in around 1638-9, such as the sketch on the right in Berlin of a bearded old man in a high fur hat. So for the time being, the date of the drawing remains somewhat open in my view. Another Abrams drawing that need not detain us too long is the so-called Zacharias and the Angel, another drawing of around 1634 to 35. The main problem here is in identifying the subject. For style, there are links to a number of documentary drawings by Rembrandt, drawings that are either signed or unimpeachably connected with other works by Rembrandt. And I don't have anything to add to what I have written on my website, which of course reflects much of what was written in the Greenwich catalogue. I have yet to catalogue on my website the 4 Studies of Male Heads, one of the highlights of the Abrams collection. It's a self-evident masterpiece, once more datable to the mid or later 1630s, perhaps around 1637. Again, the drawing presents no attributional problems, but it is worth focusing on the head on the right, with its slightly stiff delineation of the facial features and strong pentimento in the hat or cap. Despite being the least successfully characterized of the 4 heads, the clarity and confidence of Rembrandt's corrections in the adjustments to the cap and to the line of the jaw leave us in no doubt of the drawing's exceptional quality. We now return to a more problematic sheet, the Holy Family in the Carpenter's shop, now on the upper left of the screen. As with the smaller sketch of an orator related to Rembrandt's St. John the Baptist preaching, it was first published in the Greenwich catalogue in 2011, and again this is because most of us had remained undecided or sceptical about its authorship. On my website I've linked it with 2 drawings, first with the Berlin drawing, Benesch 95, of Jacob lamenting at the sight of Joseph's blood-stained cloak, here on the upper right. The 2 figures in the middle are drawn in a similar shorthand to the children in the lower left of the Abrams drawing. But the different degree of energy and focus in the Berlin drawing leaves the Abrams sheet looking tame, not in itself a reason to dismiss it, but even the Berlin drawing, though I tend to accept it, is quite far removed from Rembrandt's documentary drawings, and other comparisons raise further doubts about the attribution of the Abrams sheet, as with the drawing of an artist in his studio here on the right, a work not accepted by Benesch or anyone else since Hofstede de Groot in 1906. Jeroen Gilte, in an article in Master Drawings in 2015, agreed with my tentative suggestion for the latter, that it could be by Ferdinand Ball. Certainly the habit of keeping the pen on the page without lifting it often, leading to long but rather slack details, seems characteristic of many drawings attributed to Ball, and this may indeed be the correct answer for the Abrams drawing as well. Both works are fascinating from an iconographic point of view, with their glimpses into interiors that could well reflect those in Rembrandt's own house. The imaginative power of the Abrams drawing should be stressed too, with Joseph's knee bearing down on the plank he is sawing, and the Virgin cutting her sewing thread with her teeth. We now come on to the 3 black chalk drawings by Rembrandt in the Abrams collection, which have of course been thoroughly studied by Bill Robinson, who has focused on Rembrandt's black chalk drawings in particular, and wrote these up in the Greenwich Catalogue of 2011, so they needn't detain us long. The Abrams Kneeling Man, now on the left of the screen, has never been doubted, and in style the drawing compares well with others in black chalk, some of them made in the Leiden period, such as the documentary drawing for Rembrandt's etching of St. Peter and John at the gate of the temple of around 1629, and here on the right. This would place the drawing around 1629, a few years earlier than Benesch thought, while Bill Robinson believed it to be about a decade later. I was lucky enough to find that the Basel Crozier watermark in the Abrams sheet categorically supports Bill's view, as a completely identical mark appears in a document signed by Maurits Huygens in The Hague on the 27th of March 1638. The same mark also appears in Benesch 180, the Berlin drawing of the angel departing from Manoah and his family, the verso of which bears traces of a drawing in black chalk. There are also stylistic analogies with other drawings, such as Benesch 370 here in the centre. The figure in the Abrams sheet is somewhat simplified. The blocked-out construction and the rough-hewn, though effective, shading reflecting Rembrandt's style in the Leiden period drawing, as we saw. The youth represented seems to be engaged in a narrative, and Benesch, I believe correctly, saw the figure as holding a cloak over his arms, prompting his suggestion that he could be one of Joseph's brothers holding the blood-stained cloak, as in the 1633 etching, Barch 38. The figure seems to be echoed in the 1650s by Rembrandt's pupil, Ferdinand Ball, on the left of his red chalk composition study for the continents of Scipio, now in the Academia in Vienna, Sumosky 109 it is. The way the head is drawing is particularly similar, and given that the style of the drawing looks a little more like that of Rembrandt's Leiden period, the possibility that Ball drew the present sheet in around 1638, when a pupil, in emulation of his master, cannot be wholly ruled out, but for the present, the attribution to Rembrandt is certainly to be preferred from the point of view of style. Time is short today, and I don't propose to linger over these 2 black chalk drawings. They have had the magic and illuminating wand of Bill Robinson cast over them, and everything you need to know is in the Greenwich Catalogue. They are entirely characteristic examples of Rembrandt note-taking in rapid sketches in black chalk, and probably date, as Bill argued, from the early 1640s. Now finally we come to 2 of the pearls of the collection, the 2 landscapes formerly at Chatsworth, now on the screen. All you need to know about them is in the entries by Bill Robinson and Peter Sutton in the Greenwich Catalogue, and they will not detain us very long. In my online reassessment of the drawings catalogued by Benesch, I've only reached his number 320. Well, these are numbers 1,295 and 1,314, which I may not be getting around to for a decade. But it's clear that they differ from one another in style. The more finished drawing of a farm at the top, worked up in wash, while the drawing of the Schinkelweg below is drawn on paper with a brown tone, but otherwise without wash. Perhaps for this reason it looks more spontaneous. But interestingly, both drawings are thought to date from the early 1650s. So why the stylistic difference? Of course, it's possible that the drawing below of houses on the Schinkelweg is a sketch from nature, while that above was made in the studio, or at least worked up there with the brush to make a more complete composition. But even the pen outlines don't really look the same, the drawing on the left being more lyrical with smooth moving lines. Those on the right are more scratchy and fragmented. This is a reminder that we should not expect Rembrandt always to conform to one style, even in a short period of time. He was endlessly experimental, and it is in the nature of experimentation that some results will be more satisfactory or successful than others, and we sometimes need to be flexible, even in cases where differences are apparent. There is no simple equation whereby difference equals different hands, but where there is a minor difference in style between two drawings, we do need to entertain the possibility that they are by two artists, a master and a pupil working alongside, for instance. In the case of the two details on the screen, the differences do not lead us to attribute the drawings to different hands, and yet the differences are tangible. Here, however, we do tend to see different hands, rather than viewing the Abrams drawing on the left as a preliminary sketch and the drawing on the right as another autograph variant. Even if we allow for a difference in time and suspect that the drawing on the right might have been made in the studio rather than from life, the disparity in style and the overall lack of coherence makes one suspect strongly that this is the work of a pupil. The running lines of parallel hatching towards the lower left and right provide the only moment where Rembrandt's own spirited draftsmanship might be detectable. This assessment I share, I believe, with Peter Shatbourne, which is always reassuring. But to show that this is not always the case, I will finish with a comparison with a drawing at Chatsworth related to the other Abrams landscape, which Peter thinks is by Peter de Wit. The drawing on the left, the Abrams drawing, has always been accepted as one of the finer landscape drawings from the Duke of Devonshire's collection at Chatsworth. At the lower left, we see that it was acquired from Nicholas Flinck, the son of Rembrandt's pupil Govert Flinck, from whose collection the Duke of Devonshire acquired it in 1723. Until recently, the drawing on the right, which is still at Chatsworth, and likewise from the Flinck collection, was considered in a similar light. But now arguments are put forward to differentiate the drawings and attribute them to two separate hands, with the drawing on the right being the pupil's work. One complication with the comparison is that all the wash in the drawing on the right is later and not by Rembrandt. In addition, the condition isn't very good either, with blotchy stains that undermine the optical illusion of the drawing. It seems to my eye that the distinctions between the two drawings are insufficient to enable us to reject the Chatsworth drawing with confidence. It's true that they are not identical throughout in every respect. Here are two details which I hope show what I mean. The foliage in the Abrams drawing on the left isn't drawn with exactly the same formula as the trees in the drawing still at Chatsworth on the right. But does that really mean that they're by different hands? We just saw that dissimilarities don't always mean that two drawings are by different hands, using the other Abrams drawing as an example, here on the far right. But let's try comparing two other details from the Abrams drawing, a detail that includes the amazingly drawn ducks, as well as the cattle and the delicate description of the distance. Given that the drawing on the right has been tampered with and all the grey washes later, the two works seem to me to be close enough to suggest that they are by the same hand. Looking at those cattle, the distance, and the ducks, which are identical, the differences we described should not necessarily be taken as proof that they are by two artists. The Abrams drawing is clearly the finer sheet, but of course it is also finer than many other landscape drawings we all agree are by Rembrandt. The drawing still at Chatsworth, which Peter Schaepbourne thinks is by Peter de With, shows the same farm as another in the Lucht collection in Paris, which is clearly in another style altogether, here on the right. But with this drawing, we are 2 tangents away from the Abrams drawing, and the Abrams drawings are the subject of this talk. However, if we accept that the Lucht drawing on the right, as well as the 2 landscapes in the Abrams collection, are all by Rembrandt, then I think we have admitted that we cannot expect consistency throughout Rembrandt's drawn oeuvre. Perhaps in the final analysis, the differences of opinion come down, at least in part, to different psychological projections of the cataloguers, to the degree of variety that they will allow him. So here they all are again, an exceptional group and among the best in the United States. I hope that I've paid sufficient tribute to the Greenwich catalogue, the starting point for this talk. And I also hope to have shown that the majority of these drawings raise significant and, to use one of George's favourite adjectives, interesting questions in the study of Rembrandt's drawings. Thank you very much.
I think that was pretty gentle. Our next speaker is Gregory Rubinstein, who joined Sotheby's in 1990 following curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Royal Collection in Windsor Castle. He's the worldwide head of Old Master Drawings at Sotheby's and has been since 1993, and has overseen innumerable sales from the Klaver Collection in Amsterdam in 1994 to the record-breaking sale of Raphael's Head of a Young Apostle from Chatsworth in 2012. He also orchestrated the research program that led to the acceptance as autograph of Johann Vermeer's Young Woman Seated at a Virginals, now in the Leiden Collection in New York, and widely published. Greg is an international authority on the drawings of Jan Lievens, and in 2008-09 he co-organized the monographic exhibition on this artist that was shown in Washington, Milwaukee, and Amsterdam. He also lectured at the Bruce when we had George's drawings down there, and lectured on the landscapes of Lievens. He is going to be talking, though, today about the pen and ink figure drawings by Jan Lievens, issues of style, attribution, and dating. Please welcome Greg.
No, I haven't actually. He wants me to turn my mic on. I hate that sort of build-up. But thank you, Peter, anyway. Some years ago, when I accepted Arthur Wheelock's very kind invitation to select and catalogue the drawings part of the Jan Lievens exhibition that he was organising in Washington and elsewhere, I perhaps naively expected that total immersion in the drawings of this fascinating artist would cause the scales to fall from my eyes in terms of my understanding of his drawing style. But in fact, the project threw up at least as many challenges and puzzles as it solved, and it became increasingly clear to me that in his drawings, as in his paintings, Lievens was an artist who worked in a considerable variety of styles and techniques, some of them reflecting the various influences he encountered on his artistic journey, others apparently entirely of his own invention. Now, in the context of a monographic exhibition, you can slightly, to some extent, circumvent these issues, because the primary goal is mainly to present the core of the artist's style and output as clearly as possible. And so in the exhibition, we concentrated mainly on three aspects of his drawings. And I show you here, with any luck, illustrative examples of each group, just in case there's anyone here who doesn't know what an exceptionally intriguing and talented draftsman Lievens was. The first group that we covered was the output of the years prior to his departure for England in 1632 at about the age of 25. Drawings here represented by the British Museum's head of a young man in the centre, and the great large Dresden wash drawing of the Feast of Esther, top right. These early years in which Lievens was engaged in a fascinating dialogue with Rembrandt and also with various artists surrounding their mutual teacher, Peter Lastman. The second focus of the drawings that we selected was the remarkable group of landscape drawings in pen and ink. Example, bottom right, resident not too far from here. And the third group was his marvellous group of portrait drawings, largely executed in black chalk. I'll show you on the top left. But we did include one or two examples of another type of drawing, namely figure studies in pen and ink, to indicate that this type of drawing also features within his surviving output. But it was clear from the outset that this was perhaps the most problematic aspect of his drawn legacy, at least in terms of attribution. And, of course, unless you can be reasonably sure which drawings a particular artist actually did and didn't make, you can't say anything very meaningful about their style or development. Possibly more controversial point than it should be in some contexts, but it seems to me rather an obvious one. The stylistic range of pen and ink figure drawings that have, on occasion, been attributed to Lievens is considerable, as is the number of other artists to whom these works have sometimes also been attributed. I've already mentioned Lastman and Rembrandt, but there are also confusions with artists as various as Jan Pijnas, Adam Elsheimer, Hendrik Grout, Jan Philipszoon van Boekhorst, Peter Janszoon, and Johannes Lupinius, to mention only the most frequently occurring names. I always felt that of all the unfinished business arising from the Washington exhibition, or from the drawings part of it, this was the most intriguing and possibly the most challenging to clarify in any way. It may therefore have been rather foolish of me to decide to make it the topic of my talk today, in this august milieu and in front of so many very knowledgeable drawing scholars. Oh, to be delivering it like Martin from the other side of the Atlantic. I freely admit that I have by no means sorted everything out, but I hope that even so, the articulation of the problem to be solved and of the methodology that we need to employ to solve it will still be of some interest to you, as well as the limited amount that I actually have to say about the patterns I've so far identified. Limited, not least, by the need to stick to the schedule as far as possible. So what I'm trying to clarify in this brief study is what our great and much missed source of inspiration, Egbert Haverkamp Bekerman, used to describe as the circle of possibility for the drawing style of the artist. The sort of attempt to make a Venn diagram, as it were, where you establish the limits of style which are possible for each artist, and also those for the artists who draw in a relatively similar way, nearby artists, and see how close those different patterns, those different circles approach each other, whether they overlap here and there, and that is what you need to establish in order to be able to come to the most likely conclusion about who actually made the thing. So how do you define this circle? Well, first you have to identify the core group of drawings that are absolutely, definitely by the artist. So signed works, works that are inscribed in an indicative way by the artist, or works that are indisputably connected with other securely attributed works by the artist in other media. Then you add to your core group others that are so close in style to those documentary drawings that they have to be by the same artist. And then you have to spread your net a bit wider and analyze drawings which show some considerable resemblance to those in your core group as it now stands, but also some differences, and seek to clarify whether it is in the end more likely that those drawings are by the artist in question or by another artist with a closely related style. It's by this attempt at an impossible marriage between the totally empirical and the totally subjective that one tries to arrive at a body of work that is as close as possible to complete and accurate. Obviously, there are factors such as uneven survival rates of different types of drawings, something that we've alluded to at various points in today's talks, factors that can distort our picture. But to be honest, this methodology, even with its subjective element, is about the best we can do. Moving swiftly on, let's talk about Levens rather than theory. In terms of figure drawings in pen and ink, we have just 4 securely attributed documentary sheets. All of them convincingly signed with initials, apparently in the same ink as the rest of the drawing, and in a form of initials which is very comparable to what we see on a number of the artist's portrait drawings and prints. In terms of date, we think these 4 drawings span something like 40 years, more or less his entire career as an artist. Well, that clearly leaves us with a few gaps to fill. I'll show you all 4 of them here together to highlight their stylistic similarities and diversity in an initial way, and particularly the diversity, and therefore the nature of the challenge that faces us today. Now let's go through each one in turn, looking at their particular qualities, trying to shed a little bit of light on possible origins of those qualities, and identifying some other drawings that can plausibly be attributed to Levens through stylistic comparison with these 4. The first of the 4 is the Mercury and Argos in Dresden, an early drawing that shows considerable similarities in style to the drawing style and also the compositions of Peter Lastman, teacher of both Levens and Rembrandt. Aspects like the regular, strong hatching, the forms of the face, the general compositional type, even the animals, are very, very similar to what we see in quite a few works by Lastman and others around him. It's also the study for signed print by Levens, so it's in a way it's doubly documentary. I don't want to go into too much detail about this drawing and the early ones, because that's a subject we've covered more extensively in the past elsewhere, but I do want to show you a couple of other drawings that are pretty comparable with this. The stoning of St. Paul at Lystra in the British Museum, where we see very similar facial types and approach to hatching, although in this case with the use of wash, which we don't have in the Dresden drawing. The Museus Scaevola in Leiden, again rather similar in many ways, and I think it's not too controversial to say that these are all by the same artist. And also to be shown in this context are some of the group of large, more ambitious drawings executed in a combination of brush and wash over chalk with penwork, many of which are in Dresden. I showed you briefly the Feast of Esther at the beginning on the top right. But here you see penwork, which is, where's the, oop, that's not what I wanted to do at all. I wanted to find the pointer, there we go. The penwork in areas such as this, and also perhaps more evidently in some of the other drawings, and even some of the hatching, is quite comparable to this. It's not hard to see an evolution. The second drawing of the group of 4, which is in the Lucht collection, study of an old bearded man, sometimes identified as the servant of Jan van Oldenbarneveld, but I'm not sure if there's any real reason for that, is in many ways comparable to the first drawing, to the drawing on the left screen. and in other ways rather different. We have the same sort of intense, repetitive hatching, heavy, heavy ink work, which in this case has actually eaten quite strongly into the paper. But we have an introduction of a more sinuous line, a more flowing calligraphic penwork in the hair in particular, which is different from here. On the other hand, the accents around the eyes and the way that the face is delineated is actually quite similar to the first group of drawings. The cursive approach, the linearity that you see in the hair, is something that we can only attribute to a knowledge of Van Dyck. And also even the format of the drawing, which is very, very similar to Van Dyck's famous series of prints, the iconography, the portraits. Now, Lievens left his native Leiden in February of 1632 to go to London, just 1 month before Van Dyck took up the position of court painter at the court of Charles I. We don't know whether Lievens actually went there in order to work with Van Dyck or to try and work for Charles I and ended up finding Van Dyck turning up as well, which may have been a complicated thing for him. But at least we do believe that he worked extensively with Van Dyck alongside him, painting portraits of the royal family which haven't actually survived. He was definitely closely associated with Van Dyck during this English period, and also must have come under Van Dyck's spell after he moved from London to Antwerp in 1635. Van Dyck coming and going from Antwerp for sure, but would have been a major force in that artistic milieu. The main drawings which can be compared very closely with this are that on the right screen, head of a bearded man in Bayonne, a drawing of Charles I in Turin, where we're beginning to see something slightly different going on, but overall the approach, certainly in the head, is very, very similar, even if the body is much more sparely drawn. And also worth introducing at this point is the unique head study in oil on paper in Berlin, where again we see very Van Dyckian qualities and yet elements that are surely also coming out of Lievens's previous works. Moving further away, I've got a couple of Van Dyck, rapid Van Dyck comparisons here just to emphasize the nature of the calligraphic delineation of hair, of forms and so on, and the repetitive hatching, both of which are features that crop up again and again in Van Dyck's pen drawings. Moving a little bit further on from the first drawings I've shown you, there's this very interesting and intriguing large drawing of a group of clerics of somewhat uncertain subject. No idea what's going on here, but it's a big and bold drawing. I have to confess I sold this in my youthful ignorance some 20 years ago as attributed to Jan Pynas. I am, though, in good company in misattributing it, because it was that went through various illustrious English collections, including that of Jonathan Richardson Sr., under the name of Agostino Carracci. But I think it is pretty closely comparable in style to the Lucht collection drawing on the left screen, and can be confidently attributed to Lievens. Other drawings to consider in this context, not as close to this, not perfect comparisons, any one of them, but each in their own way picking up on stylistic elements to be found in the other drawings we've seen so far. This sheet of head studies in a private collection, another study of a bearded man in private collection, this drawing which is in the Morgan Library, or museum, whatever we call it, and the related study in a French private collection. I'm sorry, that those are more similar in texture and tone than they look on the screen. That's a rather bleached out image there. So as I say, apart from possibly the heads top right, the comparison involves a slight leap, but all the individual elements in terms of the execution of details of hair, of eyes, of nose, of hatching, of shading, can be found in somewhat different combinations within the drawings in this group. That, I believe, is not the case in, for example, a drawing such as this, which was long attributed to Lievens in the Ashmolean Museum, recently featured in the Encounters exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, the very interesting portrait drawings exhibition. Not, I hasten to add, exhibited as Lievens anymore, but it did have a long history where there are certain similarities, but the overall approach is so much more repetitive and unvaried, I think. I think it's probably actually by Matthijs van den Berg, a sort of slightly enigmatic artist from, who worked in various artistic centres, Antwerp, Amsterdam, The Hague, elsewhere. This is the third of our signed drawings in Berlin. Wonderful, extravagant, dynamic, energetic sheet of figure studies, which is clearly much more cursive in the handling and energetic in a way with broadly drawn lines than anything we've seen so far, and yet which does clearly also build on what's come before. To compare with this, we can show this drawing. I'm sorry, typically this was sold by Sotheby's, and yet it's the only drawing that I haven't got a decent photograph of. Head of a half-length study of a young woman, which I think is fairly closely comparable. I would also show here the wonderful Abrams Collection drawing of the head of the old woman, although there is also a great link with the early style of Rembrandt in this drawing, as Peter Schaapbourne has pointed out in the past. And we can add to that group, I think, another head of an old man in a private collection here, a drawing which was formerly attributed to Flink, another name I didn't mention earlier, but rapid comparison with the characteristic Flink drawing here in the Abrams collection, I think shows quite clearly that that is not an attribution that holds up, and actually the drawing on the left is surely by Lievens. It's really interesting how little, in a way, of stylistic echo there is of Rembrandt and the artists in Rembrandt's circle during Lievens' drawing of his more mature period in Amsterdam, even though he was working alongside these artists in the same city for many years. We see relatively little connection during that period, during that time. Stylistically, the encounter, the overlap, is almost exclusively limited to his early years in Leiden. Then, adding to this group, I would show two more drawings, which are a bit different and a bit unusual. One of them, this extraordinary image of the interior of a painter's studio in a private collection, generally thought to date from Lievens' Antwerp period, because that was the time when he was, in a way, at his wildest, hanging out with artists like Brouwer and doing sort of unruly things. And this is thought to be a sort of a somewhat lively, humorous scene of the interior of an artist's studio. Without going into too much detail, because time doesn't allow it, I think there are plenty of elements in this that make the attribution to Lievens pretty straightforward. Details like this, the whole way that the head is executed, the hands, and so on. And then, alongside that, I would show this interior. Sorry, there's a second drawing sold by Sotheby's, of which I've only got a lousy photo. This kitchen interior scene, which takes it one step further, is slightly less obviously associable with the sign drawing, but probably closer to what we've seen of Lievens so far than anybody else I know. The only thing that comes close, possibly, actually, was this rather interesting drawing in the Rijksmuseum by Pieter Cornelissen van Rijk. Not just a thematic similarity, but I think quite a few similarities in terms of details of execution. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that the drawing on the right is by him rather than Lievens. I think there's just a slight question mark still to be resolved. In all of these drawings, I think there is a certain element of the style of Adam Elsheimer to be detected in the angularity that is combined with the sort of Van Dyckian cursiveness, and in the heavy use of pen, and in the very, very sparing or rare use of wash in many of these figure drawings. This on the right is one of the thing about Elsheimer is we have hardly any, a very, very small number of drawings of any substance that survive. But here on the right is a major sheet of figure studies in Berlin, and I think there are differences, but there are some similarities too. Now, given how close Peter Lassmann was with Elsheimer when they were both in Rome between 1604 and 1607, it's not really surprising that something of Elsheimer would have filtered back. And the influence of Jan Peinas, also close with Lastmann and Elsheimer in Rome, is, I think, also to be detected in Lievens's drawing style in drawings of this type. But the main issue is that it's really hard to see these drawings by Lievens as early works, which is what you would expect them to be if he was deriving the influence of Elsheimer via Lastmann. So questions still to be answered there too. But I show details here of 3 drawings which I give to Lievens on the left and the Elsheimer, just emphasizing that there are aspects of the anatomy and aspects of the facial types and the pen work which I think are not completely unrelated. The link with Elsheimer can also perhaps be traced through Elsheimer's great pupil Hendrik Gout, who was, of course, living and working in Utrecht from 1611 until his death in 1648. And Lievens could certainly, and very likely did, encounter him there. And I show you here the half-length figure of a man in Amsterdam on the right by Gout, and also a drawing in the Abrams collection, not necessarily because it's the closest comparison to what I'm about to show you of Lievens, but just because it's the one that's here. This type of Gout drawing has links, I think, with another group of drawings that I'm not alone in believing are by Lievens. I'm going to show you them very rapidly because I've just had the flag that time is up. But there's not much more to go. So here, the first on the lower left, these are drawings which are characterized by a very heavy, strong, repetitive hatching and a certain degree of cursive penmanship of a type that's one seen before. The drawing recently sold from the Van Rechter and Altena collection, lower left, the sheet of studies of 2 men in Berlin on the right, the 2 horsemen resting in Edinburgh. Another drawing, perhaps less certainly attributable to Lievens because on grounds purely of quality, which was sold at Christie's some years ago, Card Players. And finally, the drawing that's sometimes been described as a self-portrait in the Albertina in Vienna. In a way, the common theme is the combination of heavy, characteristically executed hatching and calligraphic penmanship in details such as hair, and emphasis on eyes in the same way. And there are common aspects, I believe, through all this group. It's also worth pointing out that the sort of hatching you see here is totally typical of Lievens's landscape drawings. And this, the only signed landscape drawing by Lievens that we know in, guess what, the Abrams Collection, is a very typical example. You see quite a similarity, I think, of the approach. And speaking of landscapes, it's worth just showing briefly here one other drawing, an important and interesting sheet, which is in the British Museum, which incorporates touches of the landscape elements that are so familiar from Lievens's works in that medium, with a group of quite boldly, rapidly executed figure studies, which again can be related back to a number of the things we've seen so far. Where I think we clearly cross the line outside our circle of possibility is with a drawing like the one on the left. one of a group of small studies of heads which were long attributed to Levens, and as you see it's got an inscription on the bottom left, but now generally thought to be by Peter Janszoon, the Amsterdam glass painter. And he works by him and by Buchhorst, and I show you here the Abrams drawing on the right, Peter Jans's teacher, Buchhorst. Drawings by Buchhorst have also frequently been misattributed to Levens, but I think we're clearly dealing with a rather different style here, different artistic personalities. Very rapidly, the final drawing of the four, which are clearly signed, is this drawing in Düsseldorf of St. Jerome in a landscape, which bears not only initials but also a date of 1665, which we assume is reasonable and plausible. There's no particular reason to think it's not. Sharing many characteristics with all the drawings we've seen so far. You can, if you want, see a little bit of a sort of a wavering of line here and there that you might want to attribute to an older artist, but I don't think there's a lot of difference to be seen here. Only one drawing I think that we should show in comparison to this, another drawing sold not that long ago at Christie's, Figure Studies, but overall, stylistically, I don't think there's a massive difference between what we've got on the left here and the Berlin sheet on the right, which we have believed is rather earlier in date. So, what conclusions, if any, can we draw from this rapid gallop through Levens's figure studies in pen and ink? Well, I think there are four or five. First, that Levens was an extremely varied artist in terms of his drawing style. Second, that he seems to have drawn inspiration directly or indirectly from perhaps a slightly wider group of artists than may previously have been thought, not just Lastman, Rembrandt and Van Dyck, but also artists such as Elsheimer, Pynas and Goud. Thirdly, that there's relatively little to go on in terms of dating, at least after the early years. Fourthly, that there's a lot more to be done. First and foremost, I think, a systematic study of the papers that Levens used in his drawings of this type, which might well help us establish patterns and groupings and get us closer to a chronology. And last conclusion is that I've said all I can say on the subject for now.
The final speaker of the afternoon is Ger Louten, who became the director of the Fondation Custodia, the Fritz Lucht Collection, in 2010. Before that, he served as head curator of the Rijksprint Cabinet in the Rijksmuseum and was curator of the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen. A deft scholar and leader, equally expert in prints and drawings, Louten has authored and helped to organize many projects, including multiple volumes in the Holstein and the New Holstein series. He also was the organizer from Pisanello to Cézanne, master drawings from the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen that was shown in Rotterdam in 1990. And more recently, Goltzius to Van Gogh, drawings and paintings from the P&N de Boer Foundation in 2014. Ger is going to be talking today about collecting Netherlandish drawings, Fritz Lucht, and Maida and George Abrams, two very nicely complementary subjects.
Yeah, does it work? Right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen allegorical figures in these drawings, and I want to evoke for you all today an allegory of time with a big sieve. And time sieves the drawings, the works of art that have come to us today to analyze as we have seen here today. You see with Lievens, with Dussart today, it seems as if there is an abundance of material that we can base our stories on, but in fact we all know how much has disappeared. I think one of the most enlightening essays addressing that subject is the article that Martin Royalton Kish wrote for the Bruegel exhibition in Rotterdam and New York some 10 years ago, where he analyzes the drawn oeuvre of Bruegel, and he says the corpus as a fragment, because we realize that the catalogue published by Hans Mielke just after he died in 1994 is not at all the oeuvre of Bruegel. It is what remains, but it is very scarce and difficult. All the drawings that Bruegel made for Hieronymus Koch for the Prince, they have survived in another context. We know, because Van Mandel writes that down, that Bruegel asked his wife, his widow, to burn his drawings after his death. And oh my God, what is a catastrophe that has caused, because he thought that his wife could be in trouble when she kept drawings with provocative subject matter. That is a testimony from the time itself already. It's very strange to realize that in the middle of the 16th century, at the time of Bruegel, there were also already drawings done for a market, signed and dated, and so there was an eye for the quality of drawings and drawing as an object to preserve, and at the same time a lot has gone lost. That sieve is used with an enormous imbalance, and we have no clue what we are talking about when we want to reconstruct these oeuvres. Still, at a certain moment in time, there have been people, like the collectors of today, who felt the need to keep these drawings, to take care of them, and to even leave a little mark on them to show that they were once theirs. We are looking at Frits Lucht, born in 1884, died in 1970, in the later years of his life, when he had already established the Fondation Custodia in Paris, and we see him in the storeroom, in the Reserve at Hotel Turgot, handling his drawings. Lucht, very early on, became fascinated by drawings. Some beautiful story that in 1898, when Queen Wilhelmina was inaugurated, there was an exhibition of Rembrandt drawings in the Stedelijk Museum, the Museum for Modern Art, and for the first time there was a large display of drawings, and he was completely captivated by that, and since then he concentrated on drawings. But what he did foremost, he became interested in that. He worked in the trade. He was a Gregory Rubinstein and a Stein Alsteins of the day. He went to work in an auction house of Frederik Müller, and he organized many important exhibitions and sales at the time. And he also became completely into the problem of marque de collection and the history of collecting. So he has made a great service to art history by concentrating on that history of collecting with his 2 volumes of marque de collection. I said last week in the Metropolitan Museum, he's the most often cited art historian in the world. That is not Panofsky or Gombrich, but it's him, because an L is already sufficient to make a reference to his work, and in every auction catalogue and in every exhibition catalogue we come across Lucht all the time. He believed that it was important to know about the provenance and to understand the whole phenomenon of the history of collecting of drawings. There are many anecdotes about how drawings came to us until way into the 19th century. I worked in the Boijmans Museum and I became interested in a terrible thing that happened there. There was a fire in the museum in the 19th century, and the insurance paid money to replace drawings that had went lost. And the director, Lamme, went to the Leembrugge sale in 1866, 18 years before Lucht was born, and he bought there in one lot 600 drawings by Willem van der Velde. Drawings that would be very in demand today if they would be spread out, but it was still possible 150 years ago in one lot to buy 600 drawings for a ridiculous price. It is only after that that these drawings became in demand, that there became an enormous competition to buy them, and we are in fact still in that ongoing process and a concentration in that sense. Lucht understood this all, and he wanted to describe that phenomenon and see what the ways of these drawings had been. He did that with the Marque de Collection, and with another major contribution, 5 volumes like this of the Répertoire de Catalogue des Ventes, where you can individualize all the sales catalogues. If you open these books, it looks like an Excel sheet, where you have columns with a number of a catalogue, where the drawings were sold by that collector, what they brought, etc. It's an unbelievable tool to reconstruct the history of drawings. What Lucht did is, after his years working in the sales in the auction room, he became, at about the time of the outbreak of the First World War, a marchand collectionneur who went around the world. He bought works of art and sold a lot with a good profit, but was able to remain drawings for himself, and he kept them his whole life through, although he was continuously selling drawings in order to improve the quality of his collection. We see him here in the universe that he created, the Salon Hollandais in Hotel Turgot, and looking with his wife. There was also a Maida Abrams in his life, that is Jo Lucht Klever, and she was the daughter of an entrepreneur with money. And when you analyze the biography that was published in 2010, you understand a little bit the ways how he was able to collect so well. If you visit the Fondation Custodia, you can hardly understand that one man bought that collection in the 20th century. George, we talked about who were the great collectors in the 20th century. Between, let's say, 1914 and 1970, when he died, 56 years, he brought together an enormously rich collection of drawings, of prints, of old books, of artist letters, autographs, and of paintings that you see in the house. He was rather widely oriented. There's a beautiful testimony of where he saw himself that dates from 1967, around the time that we saw these photographs. He is then writing an introductory text for a catalogue for the Louvre dedicated to Pierre-Jean Mariette, the greatest dealer and collector in drawings from the 18th century. He bought his little portrait by Cochin, which is a central image to the history of Mariette, and he writes this text and he signs it saying, "Your great-great-grandson, Fritz Lucht." So he positioned himself in the tradition of Mariette, and it means, I think, also that the orientation that Mariette had, and collecting prints and drawings, as you see, not only Netherlandish drawings, but in a very wide range drawings, Italian drawings, French drawings. I just show you a few here, the Lorenzo di Credi drapery study, a fantastic drawing by Dürer from 1520, around the time that he went to the Netherlands. And just as a Pax pro toto, a fantastic drawing by Watteau. He did. We go in a rhapsody through this, through the variety of things that he collected. We have here fantastic portrait miniature. We are publishing in January the collection of our portrait miniatures. He was a great admirer of that genre and had an eye for them very early on. He bought some Italian paintings. This is a painting by Guardi, where we see a capriccio of San Giorgio Maggiore. The tower is missing, and I find it indicative for his taste that he doesn't show Venice under a blue sky, but as if it's going to be tempo brutto, it gives it a sky like in a Ruisdael painting. And it is remarkable that he did sometimes such a démarrage into the Italian painting, the domain of Italian painting. He bought wonderful Netherlandish paintings like this, dialogue about art attributed to Pieter Kodde, where we see a dialogue going on in the atelier of an artist. And I ask your attention for what's happening. These people, he seems to be the artist with his dirty hands, and he's looking through an album with figure drawings. He's in dialogue with that person there, and you see the drawings are kept in an album, and the hunt for these albums to keep his drawings in, like in the 17th century, has preoccupied him his entire life. You saw these albums on the initial photograph in the depot. As if that was not enough yet, he also decided to acquire artist drawings, artist letters, I'm sorry. There are 7 letters known by Rembrandt, and 2 are in the Fondation Custodia. He bought them already very early on for an enormous amount of money, and he was interested in how Rembrandt's handwriting was, but of course also what came out of these letters. That goes on until today, and in the meantime we have 55,000 artist letters, all collected to serve art history. And then there are the prints. Some, we never count them one by one, but that it is also not the number that counts, but the quality. He brought together, for instance, a wonderful collection of prints by Lucas van Leyden and Rembrandt, and I show you here the Uilenspiegel by Lucas van Leyden. There are still only 10 impressions known of this print, and this print is very famous in art history because Rembrandt wanted to have this print for his own print collection, and then there's a witness who says that in an outcry he outbid everybody in the room, and he seems to have paid a fortune for that impression of that print. So if you can say it like that, Mariette was his model in the way he acted, he performed in the market, but also in the range of his collection. I think when you, that means that he was active in different fields. And then in the end, when you go to the subject of today, the drawings in the Netherlandish school, that is of an enormous intensity. He knew very well what he was talking about, and he had opportunities in the times that he was active that we can only dream about. He was active in the time that many people had to sell their drawings because there was a financial crisis, and he had the means, thanks to his father-in-law, to act on the market, and therefore he was able to buy such a drawing by Art van der Neer, only one of, I think, 11 of 12 drawings known by this artist. And there we go. Now we come to the parallelism with the collection of George and Maida Abrams. There is Vroom. George has dubbed him Vroom. There are landscapes with an enormous intensity, and we will go on to, but I would like to let you look at this a little bit. This is a feast to see it so big. George told me a few weeks ago when he was in Paris that in 1967-68 there was one of the most beautiful exhibitions ever dedicated to Netherlandish drawings, landscape drawings in the 17th century, and that was held in 4 places, one of them being Brussels, and he visited the Lucht family, Lucht-koppel in Paris, and they went on the train from Paris to Brussels to see the exhibition, and he said, it was a shock to see how refined and how detailed he had collected the landscapes of all these artists, and it gave him also an enormous stimulus to be active exactly in that field. So from and then, but we have seen so many today already, there is a big variety of figure drawings within that Netherlandish school. We see here Pega and Ostade and Adriaan van der Velde. And then also already a déjà vu. There are studies of animals. This is from the famous De Geijn sketchbook drawing book. There is Henstenburg, there is Eekhout. You see that there is a sort of parallel between the collection of Lucht and the collection of Maida and George Abrams in the concentration to these domains of drawing. Drawings with a secure attribution, there are not too many things that are floating around. It becomes urgent to us now because we go online with the collection to verify many of these old attributions before we let the drawings come on the internet, but many of these drawings have a secure attribution. Of course, there's Rembrandt. I show you two examples. The drawing, the interior of Rembrandt's house with Saskia in bed, and one of the landscapes. You saw another one already earlier today. They were catalogued by Peter Schatborn since he retired from the Rijksmuseum in 2001, and we published this catalogue in 2010, and that is the group of Rembrandt drawings is coming there together, and you see that if you mirror that with the other collecting couple, here they are, also surrounded, but in another way, by drawings on the wall. I think really that Lucht would find this a difficult sight, because he was a little bit afraid by the end of his life of having light on his drawings. He even was hesitant to give them to exhibitions in the late 1960s. So they keep them in portfolios, but you do justice to them in a lot of beautiful old frames, also something that Lucht liked a lot when he sent drawings to exhibitions. And here we go for the parallelie that exists. Here is a room. And here is an unbelievable drawing that, that was bought by George in the 1990s. An excursion for George to the southern Netherlands, but who would say no to a drawing that ends up to be a Peter Bruegel the Elder. I want to come to a sort of a remark about the focus here. This is a rare case of a 16th century southern Netherlandish drawing in the collection of Abrams. I think the big difference has been that George and Maida have always concentrated themselves on Netherlandish drawings, even Dutch drawings, if you can say that. When I read a number of interviews with George, which are online and published in catalogs, and then you see that he sometimes got rid of 10 French drawings in order to buy something else. So perhaps he also did a little bit what Lucht did, buy things to have collateral in case somebody else was in need of some French drawing, but he would then always ended up and harvest in the domain that he had very well defined. And I think that has been the power, that concentration has been the power in the action of the Abrams collection. Beautiful drawing by Lambert Doomer on Rouen with the Mont Sainte-Catherine. And then, yeah, if you go to figure drawings, that's a complete balance between the two collections. Here is the spectacular Buitenweg that is in the exhibition upstairs. Here is the wonderful Dujardin that we saw yesterday in the workshop. And again, we saw it already. And then this is again a little déjà vu with the presentation of Jane this morning. Unbelievable rich group of drawings of insects and animals, and beautiful Herman Saftlever still life. And then again Rembrandt. This drawing was once owned by Lucht. He sold it in the 1960s to Rudolph, and I think that George bought it from Rudolph. And you see the parallelie goes on. I could have made a double projection, and then you would see how it builds up along two lines. And finally, there's the catalogue, which echoes the catalogue that Peter did for the Lucht drawings. There are a few elements in the collection of Lucht, I think, where he showed an early taste for things that were neglected elsewhere. If you say, if Stijn said this morning, yeah, Lucht was not so keen on high finish drawings, that is true. He was a bit the result, of course, of the predilection that was defined in the 19th century for sketchy drawings. That was the influence of the taste of the pre-impressionists and the impressionists. You can see that very well. You see it also in the paintings. There are no Christian subjects. There's little Bible scenes in his paintings, and also in his drawings. It's primarily drawings that are either naar het leven, but in any case observed from life. And there are very few drawings that have that high finish. What where Lucht was perhaps a bit early in his taste, is with the taste for the Italianate artists, both in his paintings. Has a beautiful group of Italianate paintings, but also Italianate drawings. And that, I think, happened a bit late in your life, that you felt that it was important to cultivate that school as well. I am now, since 2010, in the Fondation Custodia, and I have a little bit the tendency to say not every drawing that is first class has to go to us. It's also nice that you share, but there have been a few moments that I thought, yeah, if Lucht would have been alive, he would have put his foot on this drawing. It's a bit strange if you work in the Rijksmuseum, as I did for 20 years. I talked about it with Peter often. You are responsible for a universe, for something that has been built up by generations of collectors, gifts. That it's a bit different than when you are responsible for the result of the collection activity of one person. I think that here the Maida and George Abrams curator will also experience that. So many things that we do, we tend to think Lucht is looking with us. What would he want us to do? What would he agree? I think this fantastic drawing that appeared on the market in Paris in 2010 and that we were able to buy ahead of TEFAF and ahead of everything else, thanks to Bob Habold, would really have pleased him, and it would really have been a drawing that he would have bought as well. But I remember stepping with the vetting committee into the booth of Bob Habold, and you said, "It's sold already. Who bought that?" I didn't say anything. This is also such a drawing where I think that could have gone to Newton and now to the Falk, but that we bought in that very refined representation of landscape drawings in the 17th century. This is a drawing by Jan Vermeer van Haarlem. Jeroen Gilt, I found out that he used this in a painting, dated, and it's the only connected drawing in the oeuvre of this very close follower of Ruysdael. That would also have had a wonderful place in the collection here, but yeah, it went to us. And there was another moment, I remember it very well, and I'm still grateful to you for leaving this drawing to the Fondation Custodia from the Van Rechteren Altena sale. It's a very rare drawing in the 17th century, very rare subject, and it has a place in the Fondation Custodia, and I'm so grateful that we could immediately give it a place in the exhibition Drawings for Paintings in the Age of Rembrandt that we made last year with the National Gallery in Washington, where it was exhibited next to the painting by Van Slingeland from the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. In that refined group of drawings by the Bisschop, which is here also formidably well represented, this drawing was offered to me a few years ago from an album. And I thought, well, let me see, what do we have of the Bisschop? It's very rich, but I thought the minimalism in this drawing, this is a view on Amersfoort. I don't know, you can discuss what minimal art really means, but I think that this comes pretty close. These dashes and these simple dots. I thought this is within the oeuvre, yeah, again, a step. I published it in the e-newsletter, and you said that was once mine. So you see, where you then sometimes think, I can live without that drawing, then all of a sudden it gets a place at the Fondation Custodia. I find that a wonderful, playful thing. I have memories for over 30 years of visiting your house and being in the attic on our knees in a winter day in the 1980s, looking at this fantastic object, a drawing, gouache by Avekamp. Now, yeah, let's say in its original frame, it's an unbelievable thing. And the notion that drawings were framed, there's here even a text from the time that says that the stomme in a black frame, well, that could very well have been this drawing. It is even a wintertje, I think. So that is very appropriate. And also here, the joy in these old frames and showing the appearance of such drawings in an authentic 17th century way is very close to how we enliven the domain. I show you a recent photograph of the same reserve that we saw the photograph of Lucht in. In this space, that's also very much 1950s kind of problem, we were not grounded with the electricity, and there was not a decent central heating in there. So we changed it, I think, very much in the spirit of Lucht. We made it more look like a 17th century reserve. The sketchbooks are in that cupboard that is there on the right. We reframed the Jacques Linard that is there in a Louis XIII frame. And here you see that life with albums from the 17th and 18th and 19th century, which contained drawings in a very authentic way presented. Lucht had used teak wood for these cupboards. We found a menuisier, a carpenter, who sanded them and gave them back in an ebony style, and it really, that was my intention, is as if you step a little bit into the trésor of, now let's say, Rudolf II here. The destination that Lucht and his wife found for their collection is a very special one. He went to the United States of America during the war with his family. They survived the war in America, and he became aware of the importance of the endowment. That was the way Pierpont Morgan and Frick and other people had organized the future and the perennity of their collection. And he came back, and already 2 years after their return, they created the Fondation Custodia. He said in a text, and I find that a beautiful image, and I think we can also apply it to what you do. He said, for me, the collection is like a building, and all the individual drawings are stones in that building. And he was afraid that if his heirs would start to sell drawings from that, the collection, the building would become wobbly and finally fall apart. So he made it possible until today, and Perrin, there is an endowment. We cannot touch the capital, but we can use the revenues to ensure the functioning of the Fondation Custodia, and also to remain a collecting institution, which is fantastic. You found another way to secure that, and I think that's wonderful. It comes from the same motivation and the same ideal and the same mission that you have put. Your drawings will come here now, and I don't know what Lucht saw ahead of him was to make the collection live for the future. I have just received somebody who was 14 years old in 1957, who came to the Fondation Custodia when it was just there in short pants. He was a teenager, and Lucht was there, and he said to him, Bauke, he knew him, do you like drawings? Yes, Mr. Lucht. And he said there he was in a tripartite suit, and after 5 minutes we were sitting on the floor, and he was showing me the album with Rubens' drawings. And so there was an enormous need in Lucht to share what he knew, what he had with people, and projected that in the future. I find these photographs and what we did yesterday with a workshop with all the youngsters that came especially to study elements of the collection, a wonderful, wonderful sight. The installation here on top of the building where you can look at these things at daylight is just proverbially well done. And I don't know, I find such drawings comforting, and they make me very happy and in a certain way also secure for the future. We entered here this week, and there was your exhibition. You left us the cradle of Slingerland in a Van Rechter Altena sale, but you had somebody raise your hand, it wasn't you, for the Karel van Mander drawing which is there. And on that same wall we all of a sudden have a few mannerist drawings. One of them, that fantastic Jan Muller drawing that nobody of us has seen on the market, but that came somewhere out of a drawer, I'm sure. Because I always thought, yeah, like Lucht, that kind of mannerism went a bit too far for you. But I think that both with the Italianate landscape drawings and with the mannerists, you tend to enlarge your vision a little bit and allow that now more. Yesterday I went here to the bookshop and I found a poetry book by Billy Collins that's called The Rain in Portugal. And he explains, if I would have said the rain in the country next to Portugal, they would think I was a rhymer. But he wrote a poem after having seen the Goltzius exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum that I was guilty for, and he wrote a fantastic poem that is exactly about the confrontation of mannerism and realism. Henrik Goltzius' Icarus, 1588. The Icarus, Auden favored, was tiny legs disappearing with a splash into a green bay, while everyone else went on with their business, fisherman and sailor, shepherd and sheep. But in this version, the plight of the boy in all his muscular plunging fills the circular canvas, as if he were falling through a hole in the world, passing through the lens of our seeing him. It's hard to read the expression on a pair of legs, but here we have the horrified face contorted with regret, not unlike the beady-eyed Wile E. Coyote who pauses in mid-air to share with us his moment of fatal realization before beginning his long descent into a canyon. It is as if Auden's Bruegel had been run backwards to produce an amazing sight, a wet boy rising into the sky, and then a sudden close-up to show the sorrow or the stupidity, however we like to picture the consequences of not listening to your father or flying too high, too close to the source of heat and light. And to enhance the mythic drama, this Icarus is presented as one of the four disgracers, where he joins Phaeton, who also took the sun lightly, Ixion, bound to a fire-spoked wheel, and Tantalus, who served up his son for dinner, each figure tumbling operatically in a rondo of air. To think of it, to think if they were left in the hands of Bruegel, one might have ended up as a tangle of limbs in an oak, another as a force face down in a haycock, and the last just a hole in the roof of a barn. Thank you.
We'll take only 2 questions because we've run over time, and we'd like to have a little discussion with George. So can I take 2 questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Maybe we can just move to George. We've obviously answered. There's a question up there. Yes, sir. Sure. It's.
So I just wanted to say something about, we've talked about connoisseurship. What hasn't been addressed since last night, less than 24 hours, is passion. And it's really George's passion that me as an art dealer have been struck with since the beginning of what is now a long-standing relationship. Some of the drawings that have passed through my hand have very proudly for me been shown on the screen, including some of the sheets that Ger has purchased from me and a number of drawings that George has purchased from me. One of my proudest moments was, in a way, for both George and I, one of our most humiliating moments as well. One of the most beautiful drawings in the collection is actually a drawing where George used all his strategy, cunning, anxiety, and passion to get to that drawing. What happened is that the Rembrandt sheet with the 4 heads, which is clearly a favorite of many people because it's so typical of Rembrandt's style that we appreciate, Oriental dress, bearded gentleman. When the hammer fell, and it fell to me, it had turned out that George had simply let me do the bidding without knowing that I'd been doing the bidding for him. He'd led me to think that I was the owner of a drawing. He knew at that point that I was only going to be the owner of that drawing for a very brief moment. As it was prior to a long friendship, the beginning of a long relationship, I felt very good about buying that drawing. I don't know if it took 20 city blocks from where the hammer fell, or 20 phone calls that George made to me, but it took 20 some odd moves, one way or another, for him to sit in front of me to discuss with me, the proud owner of the drawing, and him fully realizing, probably after a sleepless night, full of anxiety, which I had felt the night before buying the drawing. So in a way, we were repeating an experience. And knowing full well George's reputation, I thought, how can I get the better, or at least enough of a profit? I owned it, I purchased it together in association with a friend of mine. How can I at least make my partner and myself proud of having been the owner of this drawing? George finally came to the office, and I don't know if he followed me for 20 city blocks or if he made 20 phone calls. But he came to my office, and I thought, well, I'm quite tall, so it'll be a sort of natural thing if I put him on a slightly lower chair than myself. So from a position, and that's the reason really why I came down, I didn't want to address this audience, nor you, George, from, again, a position of superiority. I came down really, and I actually should sit down, because I should be at least as low as you in this. And what I remember of that moment is that, you know, we were going to get together on the prize. But what struck me was that I saw the passion in the man's face. And what struck me even more is, and I've never seen that, although I have that experience as well, when I bid in an auction, these sort of anxieties come over me. When I bought the Van Hoogstraten self-portrait as a young man, Ger was somewhere in the room, standing there as well, and I thought, boy, with all that lucht money, maybe he'll pay a lot for this drawing, and he didn't. So the anxiety can get to you in the pursuit of buying drawings, more than paintings, more than anything else. You can become very attached the night before, the weeks before, the years before, in George's case, about how you will actually become the owner of a work of art. When I saw George, of a position slightly inferior than mine, shaking in front of me, I thought, this man is absolutely obsessed. His poor family, other than Maida here. What happened last night and the nights before? He played me out. He let me bid. He let me think that I would be the owner. And he's trembling, the way Thomas Mann describes people who tremble in front of beauty. He was trembling in front of a young art dealer who just thought he had the better of him, but didn't at all. He was just, for a very brief moment, the owner of a wonderful Rembrandt drawing. So the trembling, the anxiety, last night Bill addressed brilliantly the virtues and the vices of art collectors. I wanted to add to that the anxiety and the passion, because they are crucial in the pursuit of drawings. And when you play your cards right, you get what you want. And in George's case, he really did. In the second half of the 20th century, he put together the finest collection. And through this generosity, I think he did a fabulous job. And I just wanted to congratulate him right here, right now, on a level playing field.
Great. Maybe we'll just move to our discussion with George. George, I think you have to turn on your mic.
Before, is this on?
I think you have to push the button.
Before you ask any questions,
I don't think it's on yet, George.
Can you hear now?
Nope. You got to push it.
I did. Okay. Yeah, I do. Before Peter asks any questions, I'd like to make an addendum to Bob's wonderful remarks about my passion. He neglected to tell you that he had a partner in a deal who I'd already made a deal with to be on my side while he was walking up the road. And so I had at least half the drawing tied up. And her talked about Fritz looked. It's hard for people who are here now to realize that Maida and I actually knew Fritz looked very well when we were young collectors. To make the point you made, Kerr, he welcomed us in 1961 to his home and to Custodia. And I remember we were on our way back from Amsterdam. We stopped in Paris. We had 3 drawings that we bought, and we took them to show him. And they were good drawings, actually. We didn't know how good then. But he looked at us and said, "Don't let anybody get these out of your hands." And Fritz Lucht was one of the great collectors and scholars of the first part, or pretty much all of the 20th century. And his institute ensures that Dutch drawings and other art that he collected will go on into the indefinite future, and that students and interns and fellows and visitors and scholars will be welcomed there, just as I hope the same people will be welcomed at Harvard to work and hold and enjoy the drawings that we love, the drawings that Fritz Lucht loves are there for everybody. I hope when you go to Paris, you make a point of visiting. It'll be well worth your time. Fritz Lucht's collecting is going on through here and other people at the Netherlands Institute. And I want to make a point that my collecting is going on too, so Harvard's drawings are going to continue to be added to over the immediate future. You're up.
Your story about having finagled 1/2 of the drawing before you even met with Bob reminds me of another story that you've told in the past. I think it was about the auction world in about 1961 when you bought the famous portrait of Painas by David Bailly, and there was someone, a Mr. Coleman and a Mr. Beer. And they told you shouldn't come to the auction because a gentleman did not bid at auction, he was told.
Well, that was Hans Kalman, who was a fairly dominant figure in London at that time. He had fled from Vienna. And he was a large man and a dominant drawing dealer. And I remember Maida and I'm not sure it was 61, it may have been a little later, 67 or so, were wandering around the auction room and looking at drawings. Well, we had a purpose. We thought that we'd learn about drawings everywhere, and that included the auction rooms. But when you went to auctions in the 60s, they were dominated by dealers. There weren't other people in the room often. There was a little table, circular, and the dealers would sit in chairs around the table, and they'd call up the drawing, and a young man would bring around, and they'd look at it. They could look at it before, and then they would proceed to bid quickly, and it'd get over. But we went into the sales room, and Hans Kalman saw us, and he came over to me and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, we're looking at drawings." He said, "You know, gentlemen, don't come in to the auction rooms. And if they do, and they bid on any drawings, I'm pretty sure they won't get those drawings. Well, about a year later, you've seen one photograph of it, of a David Bay drawing of Jan Pinus came up. And I knew I was in trouble. I couldn't go into the auction room, but I thought maybe I could. And I went in and I sat in a seat that was very much visible, in one of the front rows. And Mr. Kalman looked at me and frowned, but the table was in front of us, and eventually the David Bay came up, and the young man walked it around. Kalman looked at it, and we started bidding. And at a low price, I entered the bidding. And Kalman looked at me and frowned and bid against me. And I bid again. And he bid again. Well, at that point, I shook my head, and I knew Kalman was going to bid against me. The auctioneer continued, and a dealer down the end by the name of Herbert Bear bid. And he got the drawing. Kalman stopped immediately. And he looked at me and smiled, I thought rather triumphantly. But I wasn't really that upset, because Herbert Bear was bidding for me under arrangement. We had made the arrangements the day before. The auction room was very tough. It's even tougher now.
It's very different than the Chatsworth sale, where you couldn't even get into the room. They had to have satellite galleries. Can you imagine that 6 guys sitting around a table passing the drawings around? Talk about.
No, that was a great sale. My daughter Sarah reminded me that she was with Maida and me at that sale. But I mentioned yesterday that my vision of a drawing collector was an elderly gentleman sitting in his study late at night, going through portfolios of drawings. I said, much like a miser would go through gold coins. The Chatsworth sale changed the whole world. It was in 1984, and there were 71 drawings, and they were extraordinary. The only reason they got to auction was that the negotiations between the British Museum and the Chatsworth people broke down. So Christie's got the sale, and everybody thought that's going to be quite an extraordinary sale. Well, I had no idea how extraordinary. As we walked down King Street towards Christie's, we were shocked to see a large crowd standing outside, and there were television cars and other things, and I was thinking, what's going on? But they were all there for the Chatsworth sale, and there was a main room, not a little blue table with a green cloth around it, but a room packed with people, and a second room where they were pumping television into it, and a third. And we were really intimidated, but we walked they let us into the main room because of our being known as collectors. And I had my friend, Johnny Van Heften, who was a painting dealer, but a good friend of many people here. We sat beside each other, and I remember the signal we worked was that I would hold his knee, and when I took my hand off, stop bidding. But if my hand stayed there, he should be bidding. The Rembrandt, which is an extraordinary landscape, and we've seen it many times with the cow and the ducks, came up, and we were bidding. Johnny says that he still feels the pain of my hand to this day. But we did get that, and the auctioneer said, well, to the young Dutchman, Van Heften, afterwards. And people didn't know that we had bought it. And in fact, I was terrified because I didn't have the money to pay for it. I had to work that out. Luckily, the British government blocked the export 3 times. So I had a year and a half, and during that time I put the money together, and John Rowland, who was the head of the print room and made presentations on export license, called me one day and said, I've just signed the export license for your drawing. We're taking the other Rembrandt that the Getty had bought. And I said, you've signed it? And he said, yes. Is it available now? He said, yes. So I flew over that night and picked it up before he changed his mind. And we had it back in the United States in no time. But I remember the chats with very well.
I know you do. You obviously have certain artists you collect in quantity, and you must have favorites because people like Dussart and Rembrandt and Lievens and Ostade are very well represented in your collection. But I wonder, George, do you also collect with an eye for the kind of historical circumstances of groups of artists? You have, for example, von Mander, Goltzius, and Cornelis van Haarlem. And did you consciously think of their academy when you were bringing those things together?
The answer to that is yes and no. We acquired the great Goltzius nude. Similar circumstances. I was very interested. A beautiful drawing, one of our best. And we acquired that one. We had wanted it, and we expected to bid on it. But in Amsterdam, I was approached by the Rijksmuseum, and they said that they were interested in it, and they wanted to buy it. And would I take that into account? And a little while later, Bram Mai of the Boymans Museum came to me and said they were interested in it, and would I take that into account? I decided that the Dutch interest in it was so intense that I probably would not bid, and I didn't. I went home. About a week later, I think I called Peter Schatboom, and I said, well, did you get the Goltzius? Actually, it was a couple of days later. Did you get the Goltzius? And he said, no, it went too high. I said, and the Boymans didn't get it? Who got it? And Peter said, Berners got it, C.J. Berners in Dusseldorf. I said, thank you. And I called a friend of mine there who happened to be the key person in C.J. Berner, Frau Muthmann, and I said, do you have that Goltzius drawing still? And she said, yes. And I said, are you going to be in your office tomorrow? And she said, yes. I said, well, let's have lunch. And I flew over, and we had a talk. And I want to say that dealers have been wonderful to us, especially when we were younger. Not so much now. But they have been wonderful to us. And we worked out a very quick arrangement. It was very fair. And under the laws that existed then, we worked out. I took that drawing home that night when I flew back to Boston. And we had that as a foundation. But then we found the Cornelis van Haarlem, the two nudes, in Maastricht, and bought that. And after that, I really felt we lacked a Carol van Mander, the third person in that situation. I couldn't find the one, and Maida and I were not naturally drawing to Mannerist drawings, but I couldn't find the Carol van Mander until the Altona one came up. And so that was our first priority in that sale. And Bob Hobbold helped us work out that. We were lucky to get it. And that set up the three.
I also noticed that you often have varied styles within one artist that you're collecting. For example, Eichhout. You have a great variety of different styles of Eichhout's work in your collection. It's true too, as Greg has shown us in your Levens. They're very varied in their style. Is this something that you consciously think about in terms of the stylistic development of an artist? Do you try to fill holes?
That is something we consciously think about.
Yeah.
But with a major caveat, we have to really like the drawing. I mean, Maida was great at keeping me from buying a drawing because it filled a hole or it was a style we didn't have of that artist. She wouldn't do that. But
obviously you get some things that complement what you already have. You had the Softlaven drawing. Of course, you get this Softlaven painting, which I think is remarkable that you could bring those two together. We can actually look at that.
And there's a little story there too. We had a wonderful Softlaven painting by Herman and Cornelius. It's a hunter lying in a landscape with a dog and the tree and the countryside off in the distance. And we were in London for sales one year, and there was the study of the hunter lying in the landscape by Cornelius Softlaven. And we went to that sale. At that time, drawings were a lot less expensive, and this one shouldn't have been expensive, but we paid quite a bit, but it meant a lot for us to get it, more than some of the other people. But it was a high enough price where I ran into a drawing dealer the next day on Bond Street. He said, "Did you hear the price that Cornelius Softlaven went for?" And I said, "I bought it."
Can you tell us the story about how you got the Bruegel?
Oh, that's a long story. I'll shorten it. I saw a catalog of a drawing which was called Attributed to Jan Bruegel. It was a small sale outside The Hague. And I thought it was an interesting drawing. It was a 16th century drawing, clearly, but I didn't know much more. But I called a dealer friend, put the friend in quotes now. And the dealer friend, I said, "Would you take a look at that drawing and see what you think of it? I think I'd like to bid on it." And I told him it was estimated, it was anonymous really, it was estimated at about $3,000 or $4,000, and I said, I'll certainly go double that, or something close to that. And I didn't hear from him. And then I called him after the sale, and I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "It went above what you indicated." I said, "Who bought it?" He said, "I did." And I said, "Well, I don't know how I feel about that. Do you think I have a right of first refusal?" He said, "Well, I like it. I'm not going to sell it." And I said, "That doesn't sound right to me." And he said, "Well, we can meet right before Maastricht. I was due to go." And we met. And I said, "Show me the drawing." He showed it to me. I said, "I want to buy it." And he said, "Well, I don't want to sell it." And I said, "Well, give me the price that you will sell it for." And then he named a price which was much too much. No, much too much, not much too much. Anyway, we talked a bit, but he wasn't budging. And I finally looked at it and said, okay, I'll buy it. And I bought it. I took it home. And then I was mad at myself because I had bought an anonymous Flemish drawing of the 16th century, very beautiful, looked special, but it was an anonymous drawing and I paid too much. So I put it into a cylinder box and wouldn't look at it for a while. I was mad at the drawing, I was mad at myself. And I didn't look at it, but Bill Robinson came by, as he did frequently, I think on a Sunday morning, and we were looking through the boxes, and he saw the drawing, and he said, wow, this is beautiful. And I said, yeah. Bill said, we ought to send a photograph to Hans Melke, who was a great authority on 16th century Netherlandish drawings and other areas in that area. And Bill took the drawing, and we got photographs and sent it off. And then about 3 weeks later, he called me early on a Sunday morning. He waited till 7, and he said, well, I got a call from Hans Melke at 3 a.m. this morning. He thought it was 3 p.m. He was a little mixed up in the timing. And he said, all I heard was, greatest discovery in years. And I said, well, what was that about? He said, and Bill said to me, he said, your drawing is by Peter Bruegel the Elder. Well, I was stunned. Bill also said, he wants us to show it to him. We've got to go over and let him see it. Well, Hans Melke, who was a very lovely person, was very sick at that time. He had cancer. But 2 weeks later, Bill and I were on an airplane. We got to Berlin, and Hans could only see one person at a time, and he was in the hospital, and Bill took the drawing to him, and he kind of looked at it, and he was very moved by it, and he confirmed it was by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and said it looked to him to be 1553, something in there. Well, Bill came out and told me, and I said briefly, I said hello briefly to Hans Melke, and we went off. I guess about a year and a half later.
I bet you took it out of the drawer.
I took it out of the drawer. But I think I left it with Bill. I'm not sure. Maybe we weren't sure where we left it. But Hans Melke's book came out, and he had it as number 7 in it, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and we were really overwhelmed because it was an exceptionally beautiful drawing, and nobody would expect to get it. But it wasn't more than a few weeks later that we were doing some preparation for an exhibition we were going to do at the British Museum in Nantes, Paris, and here. And it was under Raking Lights, and Martin Royalton Kish was with us, and suddenly he said, oh my God, there's a date there. And right beside what we thought was an inscription, but turned out to be a signature that Bruegel used when he went to Italy for two years. Right beside it was the date 1554. Hans Melke had missed by 1 year. And that's how we ended up with the Bruegel. It wouldn't otherwise be possible.
I think we're out of time, but we can take one question from the audience. Anybody have a question for George from the audience?
Intimidate them.
Well, thank you very much for a very... Oh, there it is.
Yes, I'd like to know, George, the accomplishment is enormous. Is there anything you regret in terms of situations which you couldn't master?
I have had a friend, actually it was Professor Altiner, who used to say, every collector forms two collections, the one he formed and the one he might have formed. So I could list a lot of things we missed a lot along the way, but we've had a wonderful, Maida and I had a wonderful 42 years of this magic area of old master drawings and these wonderful magical pieces of paper. And I've continued since she died. And I not only don't regret anything, I feel like I'm a very lucky person.
Thank you, George. I just want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank Susan for organizing so much of this, and for all the good folks at the FOG who've made this happen. I still call it the FOG, I'm sorry. I was here 45 years ago. And I thank all of you for coming and for being such an engaged and interesting group. Thank you.